Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in the Tokyo subway, on the morning of March 20, 1995, was thick with the usual smells of a metropolis waking up. The faint perfume of cherry blossoms clinging to commuters' coats, the sterile scent of cleaning agents, the metallic tang of the rails. It was a Monday, the start of another week in one of the world's most orderly and predictable cities. Millions of people descended into the subterranean labyrinth, a marvel of engineering and punctuality, their minds already on the day ahead, meetings to attend, deadlines to meet, families to return to in the evening. They moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, a human river flowing through concrete veins. In this world of precision and routine, the unthinkable was not just improbable, it was structurally impossible. The system was too perfect. But on that morning, 5 men, members of this same society, descended into the depths with a different purpose. They were not cogs in the city's great machine. They were its saboteurs. Each carried a simple, innocuous package, a plastic bag wrapped in newspaper, holding a colorless, odorless liquid. They boarded 5 separate trains on 3 of Tokyo's busiest lines, the Marunouchi, the Chiyoda, and the Hibiya lines, all converging on Kasumigaseki Station, the nerve center of the Japanese government. As the trains pulled into their designated stations, each man placed his package on the floor, punctured it with the sharpened tip of an umbrella, and disembarked, melting back into the anonymous morning crowds. They left behind a ticking clock, not of explosives, but of chemistry. They left behind sarin. What happened next was a violation of the laws of nature as understood by the average commuter. The air, the very medium of life, became a poison. It began subtly. A cough, a sudden dimming of vision, as pupils constricted to the size of a pinprick, a runny nose that wouldn't stop. Then came the convulsions, the foaming at the mouth, the suffocating paralysis as the nervous system, the body's own internal communication network, was hijacked and thrown into catastrophic failure. Panic erupted, but it was a confused, disoriented panic. There was no fire, no smoke, no sound of a bomb. There was only an invisible enemy turning the familiar, safe space of the subway into a gas chamber. The morning's predictable rhythm shattered into a symphony of screams, sirens, and choked breaths. Japan, a nation that had built its modern identity on peace and order, was under attack from within by an enemy it didn't know it had, using a weapon it couldn't see. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a doomsday cult. We will trace the grotesque metamorphosis of a small yoga group into a sophisticated terrorist organization capable of producing weapons of mass destruction. We will explore the mind of its leader, a half-blind guru who declared himself Christ and convinced some of Japan's brightest scientists and doctors that the only way to save humanity was to destroy it. This is the story of Aum Shinrikyo, and how it brought the apocalypse to the Tokyo metro. To understand the poison, you must first understand the man who brewed it. He was not born Shoko Asahara. He was born Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955 in a remote village on the southern island of Kyushu. He was one of 7 children and a poor family of tatami mat weavers. From birth, his life was defined by what he could not see. He was born with infantile glaucoma, leaving him completely blind in his left eye and with only partial vision in his right. This physical limitation became the central fact of his existence, a source of both immense frustration and powerful, driving ambition. Because he was partially sighted, he was sent to a boarding school for the blind. a world apart from mainstream Japanese society. Here, among other children with disabilities, he was a king. His sliver of sight gave him an advantage, and he exploited it ruthlessly, becoming a bully who dominated his completely blind classmates. Even then, the core tenets of his future personality were hardening, a deep-seated resentment toward the sighted world that had marginalized him, a craving for power and control, and a belief in his own special destiny. He graduated with dreams of entering a prestigious university, like the University of Tokyo, but his applications were rejected. He failed to get into medical school. These rejections were profound wounds to his narcissistic ego. He turned instead to traditional Chinese medicine, studying acupuncture and moxibustion, and eventually opened his own pharmacy. He was a small-time businessman, a husband, and a father. But Chizuo Matsumoto was restless. He felt a greatness within him that the mundane world refused to acknowledge. He craved a larger stage. His quest for meaning led him down a spiritual path, a journey common for many in the 1980s, a time of immense economic prosperity in Japan, but also a growing spiritual vacuum. He dabbled in various New Age philosophies and religions, before founding his own small yoga and meditation group in 1984, in a one-room apartment in Tokyo's Shibuya district. He called it Aum Shinrikyo no Kai, the Aum Society of Mountain Hermits. At this stage, it was unremarkable, one of thousands of similar groups catering to young people searching for enlightenment. It was here that Chizuo Matsumoto began his great act of self-creation. He traveled to India, claiming to have studied with Himalayan masters. He claimed to have achieved enlightenment, to have unlocked immense psychic powers, including levitation. He published photos, grainy and ambiguous, that he insisted showed him floating cross-legged inches above the ground. He changed his name to Shoko Asahara. Shoko combined characters for bright and soaring, while Asahara was a common surname. He was crafting a persona, an enlightened master, a guru. The ideology he began to preach was a bizarre, syncretic cocktail, a potent brew that would prove intoxicating to his followers. He took the esoteric traditions of Tibetan Buddhism and Hinduism, blended them with the apocalyptic prophecies of the Christian Book of Revelation, and seasoned it all with the writings of Nostradamus. At the center of this new religion was Asahara himself. He was not just a teacher. He was the reincarnation of Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction and creation. He was also, he claimed, the Lamb of God, the Christ returned to earth for the final judgment. He preached that the world was irredeemably corrupt, poisoned by materialism and sin. A final, cataclysmic war, and Armageddon, was inevitable and imminent. This war would be fought with nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, a final baptism of fire that would cleanse the planet. Only those who followed him, the members of Aum Shinrikyo, would survive to build a new utopian world. This message, however strange it might sound, found a surprisingly receptive audience. Asahara was a charismatic speaker, possessed of an unnerving intensity. He spoke to a generation of young, highly educated Japanese who felt alienated and unfulfilled by the rigid conformity and crushing pressures of corporate life. They were the children of Japan's economic miracle, promised prosperity and stability, but many found only emptiness. They were brilliant engineers, physicists, doctors, and lawyers who had excelled in the country's demanding education system, yet felt adrift. AUM offered them something the mainstream could not: a sense of purpose, a community, and a clear, if terrifying, explanation for the state of the world. It gave them an enemy to fight and a messiah to follow. The recruitment process was systematic. AUM published books and manga, hosted seminars, and ran yoga studios. They targeted the elite, setting up recruitment circles at Japan's top universities. They sought out not just believers, but specialists. They needed chemists to create the poisons, physicists to work on laser weapons, doctors to study the effects of nerve agents, and engineers to build their factories of death. To these brilliant but socially isolated individuals, Asahara offered a radical alternative. He told them their scientific knowledge was not meant for designing better consumer electronics or more efficient cars. It was meant for a higher, sacred purpose, to build the arsenal for the final war and save humanity from itself. In a society that valued the group over the individual, Asahara created a new, more powerful group, an elite spiritual vanguard with a divine mission. Once inside the cult, the process of indoctrination and control was total. New followers were encouraged, and then forced to sever all ties with their families and friends. They donated their life savings, their homes, and their inheritances to AUM, which quickly amassed a fortune worth an estimated $1 billion. Life within the cult's communes was a grueling regimen of ascetic practices. Followers endured long periods of fasting, sleep deprivation, and meditation in sensory deprivation chambers. They were subjected to bizarre and often painful initiation rites. They were given psychedelic drugs like LSD, which Asahara claimed would accelerate their spiritual development, but which, in reality, served to break down their psychological defenses and make them more susceptible to his control. The theology itself contained the seeds of violence. Asahara developed a concept he called POA. It was a twisted interpretation of a Tibetan Buddhist principle concerning the transfer of consciousness at the moment of death. In Asahara's hands, POA became a justification for murder. He taught that by killing a sinner, a person with bad karma, one was not committing a sin but performing an act of mercy. The killing would prevent the sinner from accumulating more bad karma, thus saving their soul and elevating them to a higher state in their next life. The killer, acting on the guru's orders, would also gain spiritual merit. With this single, perverse doctrine, Shoko Asahara removed the moral and ethical barriers to murder. He gave his followers divine permission to kill, transforming them from spiritual seekers into holy assassins. As Aum Shinrikyo grew in wealth and membership throughout the late 1980s, it also grew in paranoia and militancy. Asahara began to see enemies everywhere. The Japanese government, the police, the United States, rival religious groups, and a global conspiracy of Jews and Freemasons that he believed was secretly controlling the world. He started to refer to his organization as a government in exile, complete with its own ministries. There was a ministry of science and technology, tasked with developing advanced weaponry. There was a ministry of health, which ran hospitals and conducted medical experiments. And there was a ministry of intelligence, responsible for espionage, surveillance, and internal security. The cult was no longer just a religion. It was becoming a proto-state, an apocalyptic shadow government, preparing for war. The first clear sign that AUM had crossed the line from a fringe cult to a murderous organization came in 1989. A young lawyer named Tsutsumi Sakamoto was leading a group of families who were trying to get their children out of the cult. He was preparing to file a major lawsuit against AUM and had publicly criticized Asahara, questioning his so-called psychic powers. Sakamoto was a threat, a public voice of dissent that could damage the cult's reputation and stem the flow of new recruits and money. Asahara, according to the later testimony of his followers, gave the order. On November 4, 1989, a team of AUM members broke into Sakamoto's apartment in Yokohama. They injected him, his wife, and their 1-year-old son with potassium chloride, killing them. They then took the bodies to 3 separate rural locations and buried them in secret graves. The Sakamoto family simply vanished. The police investigation went nowhere, and for years their disappearance remained a mystery. Within AUM, however, the message was clear. The POA doctrine was no longer a theory. The war against the outside world had begun, and the first casualties had been taken. The cult had tasted blood, and gotten away with it. Following the Sakamoto murders, Asahara's ambitions grew more grandiose, and his paranoia more acute. In 1990, he and 24 of his top followers ran for seats in the Japanese parliament under the banner of the Shinrikyo, or Supreme Truth Party. They campaigned in bizarre fashion, wearing masks of Asahara's face and singing songs praising their guru. Their political platform was a mixture of apocalyptic warnings and populist promises. The result was a humiliating failure. Not a single AUM candidate was elected, and Asahara himself received a paltry number of votes. For a man who believed himself to be a living god, this public rejection was an intolerable insult. It confirmed his belief that the world was corrupt beyond saving and could not be changed through peaceful, democratic means. The only path left was violence. After the election defeat, Asahara's teachings took a dark and decisive turn. He delivered a sermon to his inner circle, in which he declared that salvation would now come only through the violent overthrow of the existing world order. He accelerated his plans to arm AUM for the final battle. The cult began to stockpile weapons, buying rifles and attempting to manufacture their own automatic guns based on the design of the Russian AK-74. They sent agents to Russia, a country in post-Soviet chaos, to try and purchase tanks, helicopters, and even a nuclear warhead. While those efforts failed, they did manage to acquire the design specifications for the AK-74 and a decommissioned Mi-17 military helicopter. But Asahara's true ambition lay in the realm of unconventional weapons. He was obsessed with the idea of wielding the ultimate power, the power to kill on a massive, indiscriminate scale. This obsession led him to establish a top-secret facility at the cult's main compound, a sprawling, isolated settlement at the foot of Mount Fuji called Kamakushiki. The facility was given the innocuous name Satyan 7, the seventh building of truth. Inside, it was anything but innocuous. It was a sophisticated, multi-story chemical weapons plant, built and operated by some of the brightest scientific minds in Japan. The head of the project was Hideo Mirai, Aum's Minister of Science and Technology, who held a master's degree in astrophysics. The chief chemist was Seiichi Endo, who had a PhD in virology and had done postgraduate work in molecular biology. These men, and others like them, turned their formidable intellects to the task of mass destruction. They experimented with a horrifying menu of poisons. They attempted to cultivate botulinum toxin and anthrax spores, setting up a bioweapons lab under Endo's direction. They even sent a team to Zaire in 1992 under the guise of a medical mission, hoping to obtain samples of the Ebola virus. Fortunately, these biological weapons programs were largely unsuccessful due to technical challenges. But their chemical weapons program was another story. They focused on the deadliest substances known to man, VX and, most notably, sarin. Sarin is a nerve agent, a compound so toxic that a single drop, absorbed through the skin or inhaled, is enough to kill an adult. It was developed by Nazi scientists in the 1930s and is classified by the United Nations as a weapon of mass destruction. For a private organization to attempt to synthesize it was unprecedented and terrifying. The process was fraught with difficulty and danger. The precursor chemicals were difficult to obtain legally, so AUM set up dummy companies to purchase them under the guise of manufacturing agricultural pesticides or ceramics. The synthesis itself was complex and hazardous. There were several accidents at Satyen 7, releasing toxic fumes that sickened cult members and wafted over the surrounding countryside, killing vegetation and alarming local residents who complained of foul odors. Despite the setbacks, by 1994, the chemists at Satyen 7 had succeeded. They had produced their first batches of crude but effective sarin. Shoko Asahara now possessed the weapon he had dreamed of, a tool of indiscriminate death that would allow him to trigger the apocalypse he so desperately craved. With their newly developed weapon in hand, Aum Shinrikyo was ready to test its capabilities. The first target was not Tokyo, but the quiet city of Matsumoto in the Japanese Alps. The attack served a dual purpose. It was a dress rehearsal for a larger operation, and it was an act of targeted assassination. AUM was embroiled in a legal dispute over a land purchase in Matsumoto, and 3 judges who were set to rule against the cult lived in the same neighborhood. Asahara ordered them eliminated. On the night of June 27, 1994, an AUM team drove a customized truck into the judge's residential neighborhood. The truck was equipped with a special apparatus designed to heat the sarin and vaporize it, releasing it as a gas through a fan. They parked the truck and unleashed their invisible poison into the warm summer air. The cloud of sarin drifted silently through the streets, seeping into homes through open windows. The results were devastating. The 3 judges fell ill but survived. However, the poison killed 7 innocent residents and injured hundreds more. The first victim to be discovered was a man named Yoshiyuki Kono. When emergency services arrived, they found his wife in a coma, from which she would never recover. Tragically, and with profound irony, the police immediately focused their suspicion on Kono himself. They discovered he had chemicals stored in his home for his hobby of photography, and concocted a theory that he had accidentally mixed them, creating a deadly gas. The Japanese media, fed by police leaks, vilified him, branding him the poison gas man. Kono was publicly shamed, his life destroyed, while the true perpetrators watched from the shadows. The Matsumoto attack was a chilling success for AUM. They had deployed a weapon of mass destruction in a civilian area, killed and injured hundreds, and crucially, had gotten away with it. The police had not only failed to identify them, but had blamed an innocent man. The cult was emboldened. Their power seemed absolute, their guru's prophecies infallible. The months following the Matsumoto attack saw Aum's paranoia and aggression escalate to a fever pitch. The police, while publicly blaming Kono, were beginning to have private suspicions about the cult, prompted by the strange smells and reports from around the Kamakushiki compound. Aum's own intelligence network, which had infiltrated police departments and government agencies, warned Asahara that a major police raid was imminent. They learned the exact date, March 22, 1995. For Asahara, this was the final provocation. The prophesied Armageddon was at hand. and the forces of the state were moving to destroy him and his followers, he decided he had to strike first. He would launch a preemptive attack on the heart of the Japanese government, an attack so devastating it would cripple the nation, throw the authorities into chaos, and spark the final war he had long predicted. The plan was audacious and meticulously coordinated. The target was the Tokyo subway system during the peak of the morning rush hour. The choice of target was diabolical in its logic. The enclosed environment of the subway cars and tunnels would contain the sarin gas, maximizing its lethality. The timing would ensure the maximum number of casualties. The specific lines chosen, the Marunouchi, Chiyoda, and Hibiya lines, were selected because they all intersected or passed through Kasumigaseki Station, the stop that serves most of Japan's government ministries, including the National Police Agency headquarters. By attacking these lines, AUM hoped to assassinate key government officials, paralyze the police force on the very day they planned to raid the cult, and create citywide chaos. The weapon would be liquid sarin, packaged in plastic bags. The delivery system was simple and low-tech. 5 pairs of cult members, 1 perpetrator to release the gas, and 1 getaway driver. The 5 perpetrators were all members of Asahara's inner circle, men who had dedicated their lives and their intellects to him. They included a senior physicist and a heart surgeon. These were not mindless thugs. They were highly intelligent, educated men who had been convinced that this act of mass murder was a sacred duty. On the evening of March 19th, they gathered at an AUM hideout in Tokyo for final preparations. They were given their last instructions by Seichi Endo, the chemist who had overseen the sarin production. The sarin they were to use was of a lower purity than the batch used in Matsumoto, which ironically may have saved lives, as it evaporated more slowly. Each perpetrator was given 2 or 3 bags, each containing about 600 milliliters of the deadly liquid. They were also given vials of atropine, an antidote, to inject themselves with if they were accidentally exposed. And so, on the morning of March 20, 1995, the 5 men set out to fulfill their guru's prophecy. Ikuo Hayashi, a 48-year-old doctor, boarded a Chiyoda line train. Kenichi Hirose, a 30-year-old physicist, boarded a Marunouchi line train. Toru Toyoda, another physicist, boarded a Hibiya line train. Masato Yokoyama, a 31-year-old engineer, boarded another Marunouchi line train. And Yasuo Hayashi, a 47-year-old electrical engineer, who carried 3 bags of sarin instead of 2, boarded another Hibiya line train. They were apostles of an apocalypse, about to deliver a sermon written in nerve gas. The first reports that reached the Tokyo Metropolitan Police and Fire Departments were confusing. Shortly after 8 a.m., calls started flooding in about an explosion on the Hibiya line at Tsukiji Station. Then came reports of sick passengers at multiple stations across the city center. First responders, expecting a fire or a bomb, were completely unprepared for what they encountered. They found platforms littered with people gasping for air, their bodies twitching uncontrollably. They saw abandoned trains with puddles of a strange, oily liquid on the floor. The initial chaos was compounded by a lack of information. No one knew what was happening. The first paramedics and police officers who rushed into the stations to help the victims did so without any protective gear, and many of them became casualties themselves. The heroes of that morning were the subway workers. Station attendants and train drivers, with no training for such an event, instinctively took action. At Kodemacho Station, 2 employees, Tsuneo Hishinuma and Mitsuteru Ota, found a leaking package on a train car floor. Realizing it was the source of the sickness, they mopped it up with newspapers and carried it to the station office. Both men died from their exposure. At Kasumigaseki Station, a station assistant named Kazumasa Takahashi picked up one of the leaking bags to remove it from the train. He collapsed and died the next day. His colleague, who also helped, died as well. These were ordinary men who, in the face of an incomprehensible horror, performed acts of extraordinary bravery, saving countless lives at the cost of their own. It was a doctor at St. Luke's International Hospital, one of the main hospitals receiving casualties, who made the first critical diagnosis. Dr. Nobuo Yanagasawa, seeing the patient's symptoms, pinpoint pupils, known as meiosis, convulsions, and respiratory failure, recognized the signs of organophosphate poisoning. He had seen similar symptoms in patients who had attempted suicide by drinking pesticides. He immediately ordered the hospital to administer the antidote, pralidoxime. His quick thinking saved many lives. Word spread to other hospitals, and slowly, the medical community began to grasp the nature of the chemical agent they were fighting. By mid-morning, military chemical weapons specialists had arrived at the affected stations. They took samples of the liquid and quickly confirmed the city's worst fears. It was sarin. Tokyo, a city that had risen from the ashes of firebombing in World War II, was now the victim of the first large-scale chemical terrorist attack in modern history. In the immediate aftermath, the city was gripped by fear and paranoia. The subway system, the lifeblood of Tokyo, was partially shut down. People were afraid to go underground, afraid to breathe the air. The attack had targeted more than just human bodies. It had targeted the very sense of safety and social trust that underpinned Japanese society. The final toll was grim. 13 people were killed, and over 6,000 were injured, many with permanent neurological damage and psychological trauma. The question on everyone's mind was, who could have done this, and why? The police, who had already been preparing to raid Aum Shinrikyo, now had little doubt about the perpetrators. The attack on March 20th was a desperate, vicious attempt to preempt their investigation. 2 days later, on March 22nd, thousands of police officers in full riot gear and gas masks descended on AUM compounds across the country. The main raid was on the sprawling Kamakushiki complex at the foot of Mount Fuji. What they found inside shocked Japan and the world. It was a factory for doomsday. They discovered tons of the precursor chemicals for sarin, enough to produce thousands of kilograms of the nerve agent, enough to kill millions of people. They found sophisticated laboratories for producing other chemical and biological agents, including VX, sodium cyanide, and anthrax cultures. They found stockpiles of drugs, piles of cash, and cells where dissident cult members had been held captive. They even found Shoko Asahara's personal Russian military helicopter. The raids confirmed that Aum Shinrikyo was not just a cult, it was a terrorist state in the making, with the ambition and the technical capability to wage war on a terrifying scale. The raid triggered a nationwide manhunt for Asahara and the key members involved in the attack. The faces of Aum's leaders were plastered on wanted posters in every train station and post office. Over the next few weeks and months, the cult's infrastructure was dismantled, and its members were arrested one by one. The getaway drivers, the chemists, the planners, all were eventually captured. The 5 men who had released the sarin were all taken into custody. The final prize was Shoko Asahara himself. For weeks, the half-blind guru, the self-proclaimed Christ, managed to evade the largest manhunt in Japanese history. Police believed he was hiding somewhere within the labyrinthine Kamakushiki compound. They searched the dozens of buildings again and again, but he was nowhere to be found. Finally, on May 16th, almost 2 months after the attack, acting on a tip from a cult member, police focused on a small, hidden space. Between the second and third floors of one of the main buildings, they found a secret soundproofed room, barely large enough for a man to lie down in. Inside, they found Shoko Asahara, meditating. With him was a large amount of cash. The god of Aum Shinrikyo, the man who had ordered the end of the world, was found hiding in a crawlspace. His capture marked the effective end of AUM as a functional organization. The legal process that followed was one of the longest and most complex in Japanese history. The trials of Asahara and his top disciples stretched on for years. The prosecution's case was built on the testimony of former cult members who, once freed from Asahara's psychological grip, described in chilling detail the inner workings of the doomsday machine. They told the story of the Sakamoto murders, the Matsumoto gassing, and the meticulous planning of the Tokyo attack. They revealed the bizarre initiation rites, the drug use, and the absolute power Asahara held over his followers. The defendants themselves presented a strange spectacle. Some, like the Dr. Ikuo Hayashi, expressed deep remorse, apologized to the victims' families, and cooperated fully with the prosecution. Hayashi's testimony was crucial in securing convictions against the other leaders. Others remained defiant, still in the thrall of their guru. Asahara's trial was a circus. He appeared in court in his purple robes, often speaking in rambling, incoherent monologues, or simply remaining silent for long periods. His lawyers argued that he was mentally incompetent and that his followers had acted on their own. The courts rejected these claims. After a trial that lasted nearly 8 years, Shoko Asahara was found guilty on 13 charges, including masterminding both the Matsumoto and Tokyo Sarin attacks, as well as the murder of the Sakamoto family. In 2004, he was sentenced to death by hanging. Over the next decade, 12 of his key followers, including the 5 perpetrators of the Tokyo attack and the chief chemists, were also sentenced to death. For years, the condemned sat on death row as a series of appeals wound their way through the legal system. The final legal appeals were exhausted in early 2018. Then, on the morning of July 6, 2018, nearly a quarter of a century after he brought terror to the Tokyo subway, Shoko Asahara was executed. In the weeks that followed, the remaining 12 condemned AUM members were also hanged. It was the largest mass execution in modern Japanese history, a final grim chapter in a story that had begun in a one-room yoga studio. The cult itself, though officially outlawed, did not entirely disappear. It splintered into successor groups, most notably one called Aleph, which continues to operate under heavy surveillance by Japanese authorities. They claim to have rejected Asahara's violent teachings, but they still revere him as their spiritual founder, a fact that deeply troubles the victims and the Japanese public. So what is the ultimate anatomy of this case? What made Aum Shinrikyo possible? It was a perfect storm, a confluence of a charismatic manipulator, a receptive audience, and a society that was ill-equipped to recognize the danger until it was too late. The first element was the personality of Shoko Asahara himself. He was a classic narcissistic cult leader, a man who transformed his own personal resentments and failures into a cosmic theology of grievance and revenge. His blindness was not a weakness but a mark of his special insight. His rejection by society was not a failure but proof of its corruption. He possessed an uncanny ability to identify and exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of others, offering absolute certainty to those who felt lost and a sense of belonging to those who felt alone. The second element was the fertile ground in which he planted his poisonous seeds. He targeted and recruited individuals who were, by any conventional measure, the best and the brightest. These were not uneducated, impressionable people. They were scientists, doctors, and engineers, products of a hyper-competitive system that had honed their intellects, but often neglected their emotional and spiritual needs. Asahara offered them a narrative that gave their skills a grand, transcendent purpose. He convinced chemists that synthesizing sarin was a sacred act, and persuaded physicists that building laser cannons was a holy mission. He co-opted the language and authority of science, melding it with mystical prophecy to create an ideology that was, for them, internally consistent and compelling. Finally, there was the context of Japanese society itself. In the 1990s, Japan was a nation that prided itself on social harmony, conformity, and low crime rates. The idea of a domestic terrorist group manufacturing weapons of mass destruction seemed like something from a science fiction movie, not a plausible threat. The police were accustomed to dealing with organized crime syndicates like the Yakuza, which operated by a certain set of unwritten rules. They were unprepared for a group that had no rational demands, that was not motivated by profit or politics in the traditional sense, but by a religious conviction to bring about the end of the world. Aum Shinrikyo operated in plain sight for years, yet the authorities failed to connect the dots, dismissing the disappearances, the complaints from neighbors, and the other warning signs as the strange behavior of a fringe religious group. The legacy of the Tokyo sarin attack is a profound and lasting scar on the Japanese psyche. It shattered the nation's sense of security and demonstrated that even the most orderly and advanced societies are vulnerable to the poison of fanaticism. The attack forced a national reckoning with the regulation of religious groups and the monitoring of potential domestic threats. The images from that morning of stricken commuters on subway platforms and hazmat-suited workers decontaminating the stations are now indelibly etched into the country's modern history. The case of Aum Shinrikyo serves as a terrifying case study in the anatomy of belief. It shows how the human need for meaning, purpose, and community can be twisted and weaponized by a charismatic leader with a malignant vision. It demonstrates that the line between a spiritual seeker and a terrorist can be erased by a sufficiently powerful and perverse ideology. Shoko Asahara convinced his followers that they were an enlightened elite, saving the world from damnation. In the end, they were just instruments of one man's narcissism, murderers who mistook poison for prayer. The real apocalypse they unleashed was not the end of the world, but the end of innocence for a city and a nation that believed such horrors only happened elsewhere. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.